So, a few reminders. If you didn't catch it, we had a workshop that I led last week via Zoom, and it went over a lot of simple ways that we can ground ourselves in the best sense. Ground ourselves more to the present moment, which enables us to just feel more present and more whole, in the sense that when we ground ourselves, as we went over in the workshop, and again, I'll put a link above to the workshop. When we ground ourselves, we no longer are stuck just thinking about things, stuck in our mind, or feel stuck with a feeling in our body, like a feeling, for instance, of fear that kind of like manifests itself in like our chest area or our stomach, for instance. These thoughts we have and these physical feelings or sensations we have in the body are allowed to be there all at the same time, and to exist without the self-judgment that we often inflict upon ourselves when we ground ourselves in the ways we went over. So I really recommend looking at that workshop if that kind of advice interests you at all. There's a ton of flexibility in terms of how you apply, these grounding ideas and various techniques into your life. But I do think it's almost an essential part of just feeling more holistically better in your moment-to-moment, day-to-day, normal, mundane life. Which brings me to my second reminder that, if you've never spoken to me on the phone or Zoom before and you're into this channel, or if you're new to this channel, you would in all likelihood benefit talking to me on Zoom or on the phone if you like what I discuss in these videos. Because if you get on the horn or get on Zoom with me and chat with me for 15 or 20 minutes, you're probably going to recognize something, I don't necessarily want to say deeper, but something different and applicable in your life by talking to me in that setting, which is a little bit different than just watching these car videos. So yeah, the second reminder is that I still am offering these free phone or Zoom short consultations. And if you'd like to set one up with me, you can simply email me at info@radicalcounselor.com. The third reminder or point I want to make is just that I had a good podcast interview with Spencer Hughes last week. I put an excerpt from it on the channel. I'll put a link above to that excerpt. Concern Neville and how a lot of these law of assumption and law of attraction ideas are marketed, and how none of this stuff that we hear these days is really all that new. It's stuff that's been around for a long time, and it's also been like in a surprisingly consistent fabric in American culture since the end of the 19th century. And that's just something that not enough people, I think, are aware of, and is worth exploring some. I mentioned Mitch Horowitz has a couple good books, including One Simple Idea. That's one of his books that just kind of talk about the history of positive thinking in the United States. And I think we get more out of these ideas, first of all, when we ground ourselves more often and aren't just in our head about them, but also when we understand the historical context of them and realize that, like, just because Neville or Abraham Hicks or Dr. Joe or whoever is really big these days doesn't mean that what they're talking about is necessarily all that new. And I have great appreciation, and I think I've learned a lot more about grounding myself in these ideas by knowing a little bit of the history. By no means am I do I have like an encyclopedic knowledge of it at all? But it's amazing how relatively few people who get into these ideas, like these Neville ideas or Abraham Hicks or whoever, how relatively few people look into the history of it, and that's one reason that like Brian Scott's channel is so great, because he explores so many different teachers. I'll put a link to Brian's channel above if you guys for some reason don't know it. But he explores a lot of teachers, that are not just new but older teachers, and that's what in my podcast Law of Attraction Explored, what I try to do as well. So those are a couple reminders. Man, I managed to go over 5 minutes in with just reminders. Of course, there's more there than just simple reminders. But what I wanted to talk about today briefly has to do, specifically with what we were discussing with grounding, right? But also, something that I don't think people necessarily think about as much as they could, which is that, like, one reason that more people don't find success or fulfillment, and when I say success, obviously most of us want some external changes in our lives, but when I say success with a lot of these manifesting ideas, the main thing I probably mean by that is feeling more inwardly fulfilled and more okay in your everyday life, feeling just better in your everyday life, right? When I say manifest a better life, that's what I mean by that. I think one reason that this stuff is difficult to apply and that it's misapplied and not explained well online is people don't realize how difficult it can be to apply certain concepts and ideas. For instance, mental diets. And I was thinking about that in terms of like also like what Richard Dotz talks about like, unplugging, right? Like unplugging from the energy supply, from all of that negative thinking that most of us have a tendency to habitually have in our lives, right? When you unplug in such a way, it really is just a form of a mental diet. Like what Dotz talks about in Dissolve the Problem is, at least in large part, simply what he's recommending really is basically a mental diet. And I'll put one more link above where a recent video I did just talking about like unplugging from the power supply. Somewhat recent video. But what people don't necessarily understand, and I know this very well because people ask me this question regularly, is like, well, like, it's like, don't think a negative, like, I want to, like, replacing negativity with positivity, basically. It's like I'm thinking lackfully about something and I have to think positively. And what I almost always tell people is, unless you're able to easily do that, don't do that. It's too hard. It's too hard. For instance, like, if like you have very little money and you want to be a millionaire, right? To go from like this habitual negative thought pattern, basically of like, oh, I'm broke. How am I going to afford these things? I don't know how I'm going to get by. To like, I'm manifesting millions of dollars and money flows to me easily. To like replace that, to become aware, first of all, that I'm having the thought like, oh, I'm broke, and then replacing it with like, oh, I'm now making millions of dollars, right? Or like, I'm going to be making millions of dollars in no time. To go from that really negative thought to that really positive thought consistently is extremely difficult for most people. So difficult that it's not even worth trying, I would say. And that's what I want to get at here in this video. It's not even worth trying usually to become positive. Unless it comes natural to you and you like using that approach. I very rarely try to be overly positive. Now, don't get me wrong. I have been into this stuff long enough and like been mental dieting in some form or another for long enough, and I guess you could say like refined my inner self-talk enough to be, to have modified the language and habitual thought patterns I have. Like I just, like, for instance, like I used to like be just, especially to other people, like my wife or whatever, like I would use much more negative language, or to friends, like much more sarcastic language. I do that much less now. Because I realized, like, I mean, sometimes it's funny and appropriate or what have you, but a lot of the time it inadvertently just perpetuates negativity. So I've cut out a large part of that. And having young children has helped me do that, because there's a lot of stuff you don't want to say in front of kids, and everybody, in my opinion, should read Emile Coué when he talks about the education of children. What you're suggesting in front of kids, the kids are very suggestible, right? So I'm not saying that, like, you're not going to modify your self-talk as you get into this stuff and become more generally positive. You probably are. But what I'm saying is, from like a personal practice, like when I notice when like negative thought patterns, and like I feel uncomfortable, like we were talking about the other day about feeling uncomfortable feelings of fear or sadness or shame or whatever, these big feelings, right, that make us uncomfortable. I'm not like, oh, I feel sad, I'm going to replace that with a happy thought or happy feeling. No way. That's way too hard. All, generally speaking, that I'm going to try to do is unplug. Disconnect the power supply, the way that Dots talks about. Vibe out. Notice that it's there, right? And then be like, I'm disconnected from it. I'm not judging it. I'm not playing into it to the best of my ability. I'm disconnecting. In Dissolve the Problem, Dots talks about, he says, we don't need to necessarily be trying to like create all these positive manifestations. We just have to stop our miscreating, and our life will dramatically improve. I am very much in line with like that type of approach. And again, you got to do what works for you. Don't listen to me, listen to yourself. But too often people get into these manifesting ideas and they're like, oh, I have to change my negative thinking to positive thinking. I got to change my negative feelings to positive feelings. For most of us, that's way too fucking hard. You're shooting yourself in the foot by doing that. It's too hard. And you want to have a degree of ease and doability. See, for me, trying to be positive, this is why people like go against toxic positivity. It's because they're trying too hard to be positive, right? And I get doing that to some extent, but it's much easier to realize that if you just disconnect from the power supply, you stop so much of this miscreating, which is fucking up your life. And, Dots, again, he gives the metaphor in Dissolve the Problem. Like if you've got ice cubes in the freezer, if you take them out of the freezer, they're going to fucking melt. Or if you unplug the freezer and it gets warmer in the freezer because it's unplugged, the ice cubes are going to melt. It may take a little bit longer if you unplug the freezer as opposed to them being out on the kitchen counter, but they're going to melt. And that's what we're looking for. Because what's melting internally in this metaphor is our resistance. Because, according to most of these manifesting ideas and, most spiritual ideas, underlying all of this resistance and all of this crap, right, is a sense of peace, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of abundance. It's naturally there. There's like this naturally universal, universe life-giving, God-giving, underlying sense of peace and fulfillment that's there. If we, let all the crap melt away. If we allow those frozen ice cubes of resistance to melt into water, everything's fine. So we don't necessarily have to try to be positive, overly positive at all. We just have to take away, subtract. Because when we get down past all the crap, we realize automatically we're fine. It's that kind of approach. So I, relatively rarely am trying to be positive when it comes to applying these deep ideas in my everyday life internally. That doesn't mean I'm not watching what I say to my kids or what I say to my wife or say to people I'm, working with or whatever. And it doesn't mean I don't, try my best to be gentle with myself, obviously. But like those real negative thoughts and feelings, it's more like I just notice them and I'm disconnecting from them. Disconnecting from the power supply. And if this seems too esoteric, and you want to try doing something like this, because again, dissolving a problem this way, the way Richard Dawes talks about, is like a mental diet. If this seems too esoteric and I don't know how to do it, try the 7-day mental diet of Emmett Fox, because that's an extreme version of a mental diet. And I'll put a link above to that if I have any links left. I think I have a link left. I think they give me 5 links a video. We have a whole playlist about the 7-day mental diet. Emmett Fox's 7-day mental diet. I always tell people, if you're unsure or if you're skeptical that these ideas work, because I still see all the time, people when I look at my YouTube comments, people are like, oh, this stuff doesn't work, da-da-da-da-da. And it's fine if you don't think it works, but if part of you is still curious if maybe it does, even though you don't think it does, what I would suggest is try the 7-day mental diet of Emmett Fox. And I think you'll find out it works. There's something to these ideas. But they're not as overly dramatic and I'm going to turn this from negative to positive. They're not as overly dramatic as that. It's more like if you unplug your freezer and you have ice cubes in there, slowly those ice cubes will melt into water. That's a very interesting process. And I think long term for a lot of us, a more gratifying, mundane process than we're used to hearing about when it comes to manifesting a better life. So if you have questions or would like to schedule a free brief consultation with me or would like coaching, I can be reached at radicalcounselor.com. Until next time, enjoy the melting.